Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today we'll be covering Thailand's infamous icon pyramid scheme, an Islamic firm linked to child abuse in Malaysia, and Singapore's founding leader Lee Kuan Yew's son being granted asylum in the UK.
We'll also be covering storms in the Philippines and Vietnam. I'm Japhet and
And I'm Lauren Mai. Today is October 31st, 2024. Last week, Greg and Elina were joined by myself and Andreyka Natalegawa to discuss the Southeast Asia program's most recent report on ASEAN's clean energy transition. But before that, let's start with our headlines. Today's news starts in the Philippines, where devastating tropical storm Trami has left more than 150 dead or missing as of today, with the number expected to rise. Nearly 1 million people are currently displaced after being driven out or losing their homes.
Massive flooding and landslides caused chaos across Luzon. The storm has been the deadliest of the 11 storms that have hit the Philippines so far this year.
The storm has already made landfall in Vietnam, uprooting trees and posing severe flood risks. We are wishing the people of the Philippines and Vietnam well in their recovery efforts and to stay safe. On to our next story, we're moving to Thailand, where the collapse of a high-profile pyramid scheme is sending shockwaves across the country. The Icon Group, led by CEO Warathapan Warayawarakun, is accused of defrauding thousands, with losses nearing 50 million and damages exceeding 47.6 million.
This case has drawn significant public attention, with 18 arrests made, including some high-profile figures. Authorities have seized luxury assets, including cars and properties worth 6.6 million, which were tied to the scheme. Investigators reveal that Icon lured victims through online courses, social media campaigns, and events featuring celebrity presenters. Icon
allegedly required members to recruit others and purchase advertisements to earn commissions, fitting the typical pyramid scheme model. But with over 10,000 complaints filed, the company promised large returns but failed to deliver. A deeper investigation by the Department of Special Investigation revealed that Icon marketed products, including supplements, some of which were unregistered with Thailand's Food and Drug Administration.
Warathapan has responded by establishing a relief center for victims, pledging cooperation with authorities. However, with the scale of the fraud exposed, the investigation has raised questions about how such schemes could operate unchecked for so long. Regulators are under pressure to prevent similar operations from resurfacing in the future.
This scandal highlights the need for tighter regulation and public awareness around fraudulent schemes, especially those disguised as legitimate business opportunities. With significant financial losses and public trust shaken, this case could be a turning point for how Thailand handles pyramid schemes moving forward.
We'll be closely following the developments as the investigation continues and as the government attempts to restore confidence. For now, it's a stark reminder that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Moving on to our next story, another investigation has unfolded now in Malaysia, where the Islamic organization Global Ikhwan Services and Business Holdings, or GISB, is at the center of multiple criminal investigations. The group is facing serious allegations of child abuse, forced labor, and organized crime. Authorities have filed charges against 22 individuals linked to GISB, signaling the scope of the inquiry and its potential legal ramifications.
GISB presents itself as a religious group operating businesses such as restaurants and supermarkets across several countries with the aim of supporting communities. However, these businesses are now under investigation for allegedly forcing children into labor, raising alarm over the conditions imposed on minors within the group.
The investigations intensified after Malaysia's government froze several bank accounts tied to GISB to prevent further financial operations while inquiries into the alleged crimes are underway. This has deepened the scrutiny on the group's activities, both in Malaysia and internationally, as the accounts were central to its operations and outreach efforts.
One of the most disturbing revelations came from GISB's own CEO, Nasiruddin Mod Ali, who admitted that there were cases of sexual abuse, including sodomy, within the organization. Although he described these as isolated incidents, the admission raises serious concerns about the organization's internal governance and accountability.
Beyond the abuse, the charges under Malaysia's organized crime laws suggest that GISB's activities may extend far beyond individual misconduct, hinting at systematic exploitation. This development casts a shadow over how religious organizations can sometimes conceal illicit activities under the guise of community outreach or business enterprises.
The impact of the scandal could ripple far beyond Malaysia's borders, given GISB's international business operations. How authorities will manage this case will not only determine the group's fate, but could also set a precedent for how governments respond to abuses by organizations blending religion, business, and social outreach. Moving over to Singapore, which has been roiled by family drama. The second son, Lee Hsien Yang, of Singapore's founding leader Lee Kuan Yew, was granted asylum in the UK after leaving Singapore in June 2022, citing government persecution.
And wasn't his brother Prime Minister of Singapore until recently? And what's this I hear about a house?
It's so complicated. Yes, Li Shenlong and Li Shenyang are the sons of Lee Kuan Yew. The drama started after their father passed away in 2015 over the use and demolition of the family home.
Lee Kuan Yew had long expressed a desire for the house to be demolished or to be privately kept as a family residence after his death. But in 2017, Li Shenyang and his sister, Li Weiling, accused their brother, then Prime Minister Li Shenglong, of opposing their father's wishes to have the house demolished, saying that he wanted to turn it into a monument.
In the years leading up to Li Shenyang's departure in 2022, the Singapore authorities began legal proceedings against his son for a contempt of court case for private social media posts criticizing the government, and also suspended his wife, lawyer Lee Swet-Fern, over her alleged improper handling of Lee Kuan Yew's will.
The will included a clause allowing Li Weiling to be allowed to stay there, but after her recent death on October 9th, the issue of the future of the home was reopened, and Li Shenyang stepped forward to report about being granted British asylum on October 22nd.
And this is and has been big news in Singapore, where Lee Kuan Yew is still widely respected for his role in Singapore's development until today. While Li Shenyang and his wife have indicated that they remain Singaporean citizens and hope to one day return, it remains to be seen when that will happen.
And that wraps up our headlines for today. If we missed anything that you wanted to hear about, do write us at scaradio@csis.org and we'll get back to you. Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with myself and Andreyka Natalegawa. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Greg Poling with CSIS, joined as always by Elina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment. Elina, how you doing?
Good to be back.
Good to have you back, and back on the West Coast, which is a little less brutal for you than all these late-night recordings in the Indo-Pacific that we've been having you do.
That's right. Some say it's the best coast, some say it's the left coast, but, in true Southeast Asian fashion, I would say there are appeals to both coasts.
No, yeah, it's the one that only has 2 seasons anyway. And today's episode, we're bringing the in-house talent. We have our CSIS colleagues, Andreyka, Natalegawa, and Lauren Mai, both of whom have been on before in various roles. Andreyka, Lauren, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks for having us.
And you two are here to talk about your recently published report with us, Energy Technologies and Decarbonization in Southeast Asia, which was published about 4 weeks ago, I guess, for those listening. This is kind of a sequel to a report that Andreyka and Daniel Fallon and I did last year on the net zero plans, decarbonization plans of all of Southeast Asia. And the big takeaway from that was that they were probably not feasible given current trends and especially given U.S. support that kind of refused to fund any natural gas or LNG in the region. And as I think we predicted, this year we saw the perverse outcome of an increase in coal use and coal imports across the region. So if the takeaway from that was either fuel LNG or watch carbon emissions increase in the region, we were batting 1,000 on that one, I'm afraid. But what that left is that all countries in the region are kind of relying on moonshot emerging technology investments to kind of make these numbers come together in a way that just isn't possible with mature technology. So we picked the biggest 4 energy markets this year, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand, and focused on which of these moonshot technologies each of them seems to be focusing on most. So whichever way you wants to start, because you split the countries up, what newfangled emerging energy tech is your country of choice hanging their hat on?
Thanks, Greg. So we'll go in alphabetical order here in the countries that we've looked at. I'll talk through Indonesia first. Indonesia occupies a really interesting position here because they've put so much thought into their energy transition by virtue of some of the work they've already been doing as a result of the JET-P agreement that they launched last year. But there's still a lot of room to grow. So when we look at how the country is approaching emerging energy technologies, a lot of the story has been about nuclear. And you can look at, for example, a lot of the recent initiatives the government has announced in terms of piloting new projects, some of the legislative work that's being done internally as well in terms of building out legal frameworks around nuclear energy. There seems to be a lot of momentum on this front. I'd also point to CCUS, our carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as something that the Indonesian government is really aggressively pushing toward. And part of this is reflective of some of the natural advantages that Indonesia has as a country in terms of its land, its geography, policy that makes it a good fit for some of these kinds of technologies. So that's, when you look at the case study that we wrote for Indonesia, at least, that's been a majority of the story. But looping back to the JET-P agreement, one of the things that we talk about in the context of the report is just that this agreement provides a seed for sort of follow-on financing. But there's still a huge gap to go in terms of closing the funding gap and finding the financing needed to fund some of these projects that are quite ambitious. And something that we also talk about in the context of the report are challenges related to what's described as captive power plants and the emissions that result from plants that are used in the context of power generation for industrial consumers. So things like the nickel industry, for example. So a lot of those emissions aren't captured in the context of the sort of JET-P roadmap. And so there's still lots of areas that Indonesia can work on in terms of building out a decarbonization plan that's sustainable, that's fiscally sound, but also realistic. Moving over to the Philippines, again, it's a similar story, at least in the context of nuclear. The Philippine government has done a lot of work in the past year in releasing an energy plan for 2023 to 2050. So they've laid out a roadmap, described multiple lines of effort for what they describe as a sustainable and resilient energy future. So a lot of this is in the context of increasing the share of renewables in energy generation, in pursuing alternative fuels, emerging technologies like nuclear, and also looking into initiatives like CCUS, similar to Indonesia. But when you look at the Philippine example here, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think part of this relates to just further institutionalization of some of the government agencies that work on issues like nuclear. So there's a roadmap to that. There's some of the groundwork to it, but there's a lot more room to grow. And one key development that we pointed to in the report is the signing of the 123 agreement with the United States on nuclear cooperation last November. So we're headed into a year from that signing, and hopefully we'll see some more developments on U.S.-Philippine cooperation on that front in the years to come. I'll toss it over to Lauren, and then maybe we can also talk through some of our recommendations as well.
Yeah, and before Lauren goes, I just want to correct the record. It didn't sound right when I said it. Andreyka was not a co-author of our first report last year on clean energy and decarbonization. That was Danielle Fallon and Karen Lee. So you were too polite or too eager for stolen credit. Let me take it back. It's Karen that did that. All right, over to you, Lauren.
Yep, thank you. So moving on to Thailand here, what they're trying to do is they're trying to wean off of the oil and gas dependency, and they are trying to move on to newer technologies. So basically, if I were to start, they are focusing on their natural energy plan, which includes 5 initiatives, with the most recent and newest initiative, which I believe is the first out of their 5, is coming out in Q3 of this year. So I believe it should be coming out soon. Basically, they would be focusing on implementing new technologies, notably on hydrogen and SMRs. So hydrogen definitely has the most interest from the private sector. Basically, Mitsubishi and the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand have signed a memorandum of understanding on the research for hydrogen, co-firing technologies for gas turbine power generation, facilities in Thailand. So basically, the hydrogen interest is relied heavily in the private sector here. The public sector is definitely more interested in nuclear, in the SMRs. However, that work was disrupted after the Fukushima disaster and now has a lack of timelines. So there are not a lot of implementation plans for SMRs just yet, but that is definitely a priority that they are trying to focus on to get off of the oil and natural gas dependency. The technology that they're definitely focusing the most on is their tried and true, which is electric vehicles. They did sell 70K more electric vehicles in 2023 than they did in 2022. And they're now providing more incentives for the private sector to invest in EVs in Thailand. So that's where they're mostly focusing on. But yes, basically echoing what Andreyka said earlier with the Philippines, there's a lot of work to go here, but they are working on it just at a slower pace. I would say moving on to Vietnam, they're definitely a lot more ambitious. They have a lot more goals. They seem to be leading in the region with their climate goals, trying to be carbon neutral by 2050, getting off of coal by 2050. But I would say that Vietnam, they are relying on, or they are trying to pursue a lot more technologies than Thailand is. But their weakness comes in that there's not a lot of implementation plans. So they've listed all of these technologies that they do want to focus on in their PDP 8 or their Power Development Plan 8. But because there's not a lot of implementation plans,
there's just not a lot of guidelines for how this is going to get done, no timelines. So it's a little bit up in the air as well. The technologies that they are the most interested in are LNG. So they're looking at LNG as a transition fuel, but then they're also looking at nuclear energy as well. Nuclear energy is definitely a recent one. So as of 2024, Vietnam is now officially considering resuming their plans to pursue nuclear power. And I believe just a few days ago, they announced that they're trying to include that formally in their PDP-8 as well. So they're adding another technology to the list, but there's not as much implementation plans as there should be, or as they are trying to pursue. Otherwise, their tried and true renewable energy technologies are solar and wind. They do have a little bit more of a roadmap for that, but at the same time, it's not as in-depth as people are wishing. So I'll end it there for now.
So I don't want to put anybody in a difficult position, but the question that I had at the beginning of our conversation was usually sequels, well, it's up in the air, right? Sequels can be either like worse than the original or better. And it seems to me you've narrowed down your countries this time around. I'm not going to go into, which report was better or worse because they have their own merits. But one of the questions that did come up to me immediately when I read this report was, why is it that these 4 countries that you've chosen are looking so deeply into unproven technologies, right? And particularly CCUS. A lot of this remains kind of theoretical. I think you mentioned in passing that there hasn't been sufficient funding for transfer of technology in renewables, for example. But why are countries willing to invest so much in something that still remains a mystery to much of the world?
That's a great question. And first, just to touch on the nature of a sequel, I mean, this is one of the fun sequels where the people who wrote this, neither Lauren or I worked on the previous report directly. And so it's one of those sequels where the entire creative staff is turned over. It's fun.
So it's the Last Jedi of Southeast Asia decarbonization reports. That was well received.
I'm a fan.
Famously everybody's favorite Star Wars movie.
I'm a fan. So, I think to your question of why some of these countries are pursuing these technologies, I think part of it is just they're sort of the big, flashy, exciting initiatives, right? There's a lot of potential. And so I think for a lot of these countries, there's just sort of natural draw in that front. On the other hand, there's also economic opportunities related to some of these efforts. When you look at CCUS, for example, in the context of Indonesia, part of the regulations that Indonesia issued as it relates to CCUS was sort of stipulations regarding foreign emitters and their ability to import carbon dioxide into Indonesia, provided that they were investing in Indonesia in some capacity. And so there's almost this financial incentive from that front. So I would presume that, at least from the perspective of some of these governments, these are technologies that will not only assist with their energy transitions, but also could be lucrative down the line. But I think we do acknowledge in some form that these are unproven technologies. And I think one of the recommendations that we point to in the report is just making sure that countries still balance their efforts as it relates to some of these emerging energy technologies with continued investment in other forms of power generation, including renewable technologies that we've been using for quite some time and will continue to use. And when you look at, again, I'm going to bring up Indonesia, for example, these sort of jet piece scenarios outlined in the roadmap show that sort of nuclear technologies will only account for a pretty small amount of the country's power generation by 2050. And that's already taking into account the developments in sort of the best case sort of jet piece scenario. And so this is just one part of what the energy mix could look like. But I think our point being that this should just be one line of effort among many.
I would say I completely agree. In terms of Thailand, I mean, a lot of these new technologies are untapped markets, right? And so seeing Thailand's success with electric vehicles, it makes sense that they want to pursue new technologies that they could possibly lead in the market in, like hydrogen. So it definitely makes sense for them to pursue these new technologies to try and lead in a new market and try and, get the competitive advantage in it while it's still early on.
Yeah, there's a first mover advantage in some ways.
And Elina, when it came to selecting these countries, our goal was to figure out, okay, given last year's report that found that net zero commitments in the region are clearly unrealistic given current technologies, and that's not a South Asia problem, that's a global problem. Everybody's commitments are unrealistic. What would it take for the region as a whole to be able to close that gap. And these are the four economies you clearly have to look at, right? Indonesia is the largest, Thailand's the second largest economy, Philippines and Vietnam are the second and third most populous and the two fastest growing. And so those are Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam in particular, the places where increase in energy demand year on year is going to outstrip projected renewable installation capacity for the foreseeable future. And so if we're saying the bet is all solar and wind, what we're basically doing is flying the white flag and saying we give up.
Yeah, I think that the larger question also is, what is all this energy going to be channeled towards, right? And that's a larger philosophical question, but it's also very practical, right? Because if all this energy is going to go to EVs, for example, then you have some of the coal titans in Indonesia just diversifying their business into EVs, which the EV industry is naturally very, very polluting anyway. So are we really going to get to net zero if we're just creating new branches of pollution? But I mean, that's a bigger question that's beyond the scope of this report.
So if we look at these countries overall, I mean, they're kind of starting in the same place, even though obviously Thailand is wealthier and is actually the only one with a substantial share of natural gas. When it comes to renewables, all of them are below 10% total renewable share. I think everybody's at 7 or 8. So based on your research, if you had to kind of make odds, who's got the best shot here of making a real dent in their use of coal and oil in particular over the next, few years? Like, who's got a real shot at this if these technologies pay off?
Why does everything have to be a competition, Greg?
Yeah,
because
nobody
wants to listen to a podcast where everybody agrees.
This is a trick question. The question is, who do we want to get? Which embassy do we want to get an angry phone call from?
I mean, I can tell you which ones fund us and which ones don't, if that helps.
I'm curious to hear Lauren's take on this too, but my view is that it's almost too early to say. And okay, when you look at a country like Indonesia, for example, and I'm going back to Indonesia a lot for this discussion, but when you talk about this like weaning off of coal and oil dependencies, one of the things that we didn't discuss it in this report, but in last year's report, something we talked about is just that weaning off that dependency is really hard for a myriad reasons, not only because of sort of questions about cost and financial viability, but also just the relatively strong hold that the coal industry has as it relates to the politics of the country as well. And so there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of disentangling that whole mess of issues. And so I don't know if I'm ready to place my bets on a country like Indonesia, but there's certainly a lot of work being done. And one thing that's come to mind as well, just talking about Elina's question earlier about sort of what happens with this energy, right? Something we didn't address directly in the report, but that came up in the context of some of the conversations we had while doing the research was conversations about grid connectivity, right? And that being sort of half the battle, and that countries in the region can put in resources and make all the investments that they need to as it relates to some of these emerging energy technologies. But really, the question is just how do you get this energy to the people who need it? And that's where grid connectivity comes into play. That's something that's an important factor here as well. I don't know, Lauren, do you have any thoughts about who you'd place your bets on?
I mean, I completely agree with you in the sense that it is definitely too early to say. And also that another reason why it's hard to get off coal is because a lot of these countries are still trying to grow their economies. They're still trying to grow their income. Like, for example, Vietnam, they don't plan on decreasing their coal dependency until 2035, right? Their peak coal usage is supposed to be in 2035. And I mean, I believe it's because Vietnam has a lot of ambitious goals outside of their sustainability and energy ones. And basically, because Vietnam wants to become an upper middle income country by 2030 and eventually like a high income country by I think it's 2045, they kind of need coal to pursue that first. And so until they reach those goals and until those goals are no longer their frontmost priority, it's harder for them to wean off coal in the near future, right? So I think we'll have to wait another 10, 20 years before we can make a more informed decision here.
And Vietnam's the perfect example here because Vietnam already has the highest coal usage among these economies, almost 50%. PDP-8 says that they're going to increase coal use for more than a decade to come and then magically drive it to zero in the next 15 years after that, which is why we describe these technologies as moonshots, because I think everybody knows that these are unrealistic goals unless some magic can be pulled out of a hat, technology-wise.
Let me get into some of your recommendations. So 3 of the 4 countries that you've covered in this report have seen a change in leadership, if not government, right? And so do your findings and recommendations still hold? We're also looking at a change in the White House very soon. And both of you have recommended that, the US somehow works with all 4 of these Southeast Asian countries in a way that's enduring and sustainable regardless of whoever makes it into the White House. How realistic is that?
It'll be difficult, that's for sure. And I would say it's even more dependent on the US administration than it is all 4 Southeast Asian ones, especially in a recommendation where we recommended establishing a mechanism to better coordinate standards around developing these technologies, right? In this recommendation, we did suggest potentially revitalizing the IPEF pillar for the clean economy. And with talks about Trump wanting to potentially get rid of IPEF, right? Or being anti-IPEF, it's a little bit tricky to follow through with a recommendation like that, depending on who the candidate ends up being.
Yeah, seconding that. Energy policy is tough, right? I think there are certain areas where there's a fair amount of bipartisan consensus here in the United States. And then there are also areas where there's quite a lot of division. And so the results of the elections here in just a couple of weeks, that will matter to how the United States engages with the region as it relates to energy security and decarbonization more broadly. To your sort of initial question about how countries in the region and sort of, with changes in government there, a couple things to look at. Philippines will not change government anytime soon. They will have midterm elections next year. But, I expect that the trajectory they've been on for the past 2 years or so will continue forward. And on Indonesia, with the Prabowo administration taking office earlier this week, I think it's early days, and it remains to be seen exactly how the new Prabowo administration will approach energy security. But given the personnel sort of makeup of his cabinet, I imagine there will be a fair amount of consistency with how the Jokowi administration approached these issues. And so you may well see a lot of continuity in terms of some of the initiatives that the past government laid out and what this new government will pursue.
So, Andreyka, you mentioned the regional grid, right? And I know this report only focuses on the 4 countries, but in your research in general, did you come across any attempts to harmonize some of these efforts, these energy efforts across the ASEAN region, given that there is supposed to be an ASEAN grid?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that lay just outside the scope of this report, but it's something that we did come across over the course of our research. I think it's something that with every sort of interlocutor that we spoke with during the research process, there was an acknowledgement that there needed to be more work done in terms of harmonizing standards, harmonizing procedures between the ASEAN countries, with the end result sort of like a regional grid type concept. There's a compelling economic case for that, and there's a compelling case in terms of energy security and what that means in terms of countries being able to rely on each other, and sort of what that means for the economic integration of the bloc. But at the same time, it's a challenge, right? Because each of these countries are approaching the issue from a different direction as a result of their different energy mixes in terms of how they get their power, in terms of the different sort of political equities as it relates to different industries in each country. And so as countries are heading to the negotiating table at ASEAN meetings, there are all these different factors that come into play there. But it's something that I think that we'll be looking at pretty closely in terms of if ASEAN member states can get their act together and can work toward efforts like this. And I'll say that when you look at ASEAN as an organization, a lot of the momentum in the past few years has been around economic issues. And I think energy issues is something that there's a lot of potential around, in contrast to some of the more thorny political security questions. So there's a lot of opportunity in this space, and something we'll be watching.
Our second project, and I noticed one of the recommendations seems to be very consistent with last year's, which is that while the U.S. needs to invest in renewable energy technologies and fund the transition in these countries, it also needs to be quite realistic about the role of natural gas and the costs that will be paid if, for instance, the next administration continues the freeze on the export of U.S. LNG that we saw from the Biden administration in January 2024. Do you want to speak a little bit about the role of natural gas here as a transition technology?
Yeah, I can do that. I would say it definitely, although not ideal, is kind of their best choice when it comes to maximizing their long-term energy security. There's not a lot of other options when it comes to finding a between fuel between oil and gas or coal, between that and like an emerging new energy technology, right? So yeah, I would say LNG is definitely kind of their only choice here, not to mention like it is supported by the private sector. And so by having that funding and that support from both the public and the private sector, it definitely is their best resource in that regard.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Andreyka and Lauren, thank you for joining us. Elina, thanks as always for co-hosting, and thanks all of you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Narupat Ratanikit and Natanya Sia. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.